Welcome to Cinemophile, where we bring you the best in independent, documentary, and foreign films, and we talk to the people who made them. I'm your host, Mike Caspar, and you can find out more about the program by going to cinemaphilepod.com. The Alabama Solution, what an amazing film. In 2019, these filmmakers will be talking with visited an Alabama prison to film a revival meeting. Off camera, the incarcerated men whisper a message of terrible things that are going on and they're being kept secret from the public. This is a film with, I assume, unprecedented direct access to the people in this particular prison in Alabama. Amazing film, trust me. The film is called The Alabama Solution. We're joined today by the co-directors, Andrew Jarecki, as well as Charlotte Kaufman. To both of you, welcome to the program.
Thanks.
Thank you both. Just a shocking, stunning, infuriating, shake your fist at the screen kind of film. Let's talk a little bit what started this whole process.
Well, I've made films in and around the justice system before, and have had the unique experience of working on wrongful conviction in the case of capturing the Friedmans, and then also working on the Jinx, where we had somebody who was rightfully convicted at the end of the process, but had not been held accountable for multiple murders. So I've had the chance to see the function and dysfunction of the system, the way that it works. And I think we were hearing rumblings about the Alabama state prison system being perhaps uniquely bad, but maybe not so uniquely, that they were perhaps an example of what was going on in prisons around the country that we were not allowed to see because they were so secretive. We managed to get to volunteer in a couple of the prisons and had a chance to speak to the men who were adamant that we try to get the truth of what was happening out into the public. They were filled with stories of what was happening in the prisons outside of the areas that we or other people who were visiting were allowed to see. And that, I think, is what drove us to feel like we had to make the film.
Well, Charlotte, in the film, we see a lot of amazing footage from cell phones inside the prison. So, Charlotte, as you're diving into this story, as you're getting familiar with the dynamics, the politicians, all these elements that go into the making of the Alabama Solution, when did you feel like, my God, this is one hell of an investigative story?
From the moment that Andrew was describing, where we had the opportunity to have conversations with people, and they were whispering to us and saying, what's happening here, the public doesn't have the full story. That compelled us to want to keep looking and digging. But obviously, when you're telling a story about institutional failures and systemic issues, there are inherent challenges in terms of storytelling. It can become very academic, analytical, and especially if you can't get into if you're not able to get access to the facilities or really connect with the people who are living the experience, there are a lot of challenges to turning that into dynamic filmmaking that people can really digest and process and be on the ride for. So I think that was a concern. We felt compelled to tell the story, but that was a concern for a long time. I think, obviously meeting Melvin Ray and Kinetic Justice and Raul and some of the other men who you don't see in the film, but who we had the chance to speak with and learn from, was a very big turning point. Also, beginning to uncover a history and pattern of abuse and corruption, first through lawsuits. We started looking into pro se lawsuits, which we talk about a bit in the film, which are lawsuits filed by men for themselves without attorneys, often handwritten lawsuits. And we started creating a database of those and finding patterns of abuse and seeing, it's the same officers committing these abuses. That was a moment where we realized there is a story here. And then, unfortunately, when Stephen Davis died, and it was one of the officers we had been following, that really cemented the narrative arc.
I don't want to widen out too quickly in our conversation, but I feel like I'm compelled. This is Alabama, although you focus on Alabama, these kinds of abuses are taking place all around the country. I'm sure on some in various degrees of the scale and the, as you described, institutional issues that are we see in this film. It's hard to imagine it being anything but completely deliberate. And I don't want to put words in either one of your mouths, but I mean, there's no way this is an accident. There's no way this is somehow a bureaucratic, sort of glitch in the system. Andrew, well, how would you describe it?
Everybody wants public safety and everybody wants to keep their families safe. And so there's this sort of bizarre absolute where people say, well, I'm tough on crime. My opponent is not tough on crime. I mean, everybody knows that safety is critical. But I think the question is, what is the approach that keeps society the safest? And bringing people into facilities where they are destroyed as human beings and then expecting them to come out and be productive citizens is pretty unrealistic. And we've shown the film to conservative audiences who universally said, look, we may be tough on crime, but this is not what we mean by tough on crime. This is a human rights disaster that goes far beyond. And there's a reason why we have a constitution, and there's a reason why there are protections against cruel and unusual punishment. And we shouldn't be torturing people in these facilities. We shouldn't be driving them to suicide. We shouldn't be selling them drugs. And I think that's something that sort of everybody can agree on. So I think what our hope is that by showing the real life events that are happening in prison, as opposed to just having an article about it, which you can skim or ignore, by seeing the video, by seeing the evidence of what's really going on, it causes people to question whether this is a good use of our $80 billion a year that we're spending on this carceral system, whether it's actually making us safer. And so, yeah, that I think the idea of the film is to shed light on that. And with respect to the question of intentionality, we all know that a lot of bad things can happen because people don't stand up or intercede. And some people are more responsible than others. There are individual prison guards who have committed murders, but there are also bureaucrats who've decided to reduce a service or close a facility, or that it was okay to put two people into a cell together, even though one of them was very mentally disturbed and was going to likely to murder the other person. And that is what often happens. So I don't know that it's intentional in that way, but I think that the cumulative effect of our not being able to see inside and all these compromises that people make along the way, and people's willingness to just drive by a prison and just see a little sign on the side of the road, a little small metal sign that says XYZ Correctional Facility, and keep driving because we think, well, we don't need to know about that. You end up with unchecked incarceration. And prisons are an inherently authoritarian system, but it's pretty clear that if you don't have transparency, you're going to have brutality, you're going to have corruption, you're going to have a world in which wardens think it's okay for guards to be getting half of their annual income from selling drugs or selling contraband cell phones, which is what happens there. So long answer, but you see the.
Oh, I was just going to add to that. When you asked whether it's deliberate, the legal term deliberate indifference popped into my mind. And in Alabama, I think at a certain point, when they've been presented with all the facts from not just journalists, but also the federal government saying you have a system that is violating constitutional rights every single day, 24 hours across all your facilities. And your response to that is, we're not going to do anything meaningful to change that. You're now making a decision to keep going. And that is a deliberate decision you're making to defend yourself in the courts, to perpetuate this system. And so I do think it is deliberate to choose a system that relies more on retribution and punishment in the place of rehabilitation and healing. So perhaps the initial idea isn't to create torture boxes, but when you continue to perpetuate them despite the evidence of what's happening, that becomes deliberate.
And thank you for that, because what we're talking about right now is a wider view of the story, the bigger picture. I want to focus on what is essentially the catalyst for much of the story behind the Alabama solution, and that is the death of Stephen Davis and what happened to him and the attempts on the part of his family to find out what happened that drives so much of the narrative in this film. And it's important and it illustrates what we have been talking about. But also to see the men who are going to spend, in all likelihood, the rest of their life in jail, who are obviously intelligent, insightful, empathetic. They're empathetic people for sure in the film. Like we're talking about Robert Earl and Melvin Ray and others who are in the film. The fact that they've maintained some level of humanity under the circumstances is freaking remarkable. After what they've been through. So while this is an indictment of a system, there is a tremendous amount of amazing people. And it is certainly relevant and important to talk about the crimes for which they were convicted, whether or not there was justice done or not. But in addition to that, to see a system that is designed to deprive and destroy their sense of humanity is something I want to talk about as well.
Yeah, Andrew and I often talk about how it's a film about the darkest things that humans can do to each other, but also an example of incredible resilience.
Amazing.
Spiritual fortitude. And that does make it even more painful to see how destructive these systems are and all of the human potential that is trapped inside these facilities, not to mention the family members who are suffering along with them.
You brought to mind, I'm just thinking about all the sort of banality of evil and how often it's a lot of tiny decisions and each person's making one small decision that they don't see adding up to a bigger decision. The decision, for example, Steve Marshall, the Attorney General, who says there's an argument that we have a systemic problem in all of our facilities, and I wholeheartedly disagree with that. It's hard to imagine, since he has access to all the same information we do, since he read, presumably, the findings letters from the Department of Justice after their 5-year investigation. It's kind of remarkable that he would say, I just disagree, or, that's anecdotal, or it's not really happening. But you made me think of a story. Charlotte knows, I haven't told this story generally to people, but there was a young lawyer working on corporate law and was interested in Alabama. It was an extremely smart, talented young man. And he came across a case, very serious brutality case, and he immediately wanted to work on it because he said, this is my sort of pro bono activity. I feel like I need to give back and not just work on corporate things. And he said, so I'm representing this person, and he was looking for some advice. And I said, listen, it's a great thing that you're representing this man, and I know you could be getting paid lots of money per hour, and we'll certainly help you in whatever way we can. And then we had a few more phone calls, and I said to him, does your firm, which is a very big law firm, said, does your firm know that you're representing this man? And he said, yeah, I've checked with the conflicts committee and everybody's okay with it. And we do this pro bono work. And then about a week later, he called me crestfallen. And he said, as I started to talk about the case, it kind of got around the law firm in Birmingham. And I got a call from the partner who deals with conflicts. And he said, we represent the Department of Corrections, and we really feel like this case, I'm sure it has a lot of merit, but it's not the kind of case we want to take on. And so this young idealistic lawyer had to drop the case, had to drop the client. The client did not find another lawyer at that level of experience. And so for this young man, it was understandable why he was doing that. I mean, it was basically, he was at risk. His job was at risk, and he had a family to support. But that to me was one of those like little murders, one of those little moments where a well-meaning person who's doing something that's completely lawful is just discouraged from it in a way that could be damaging to him. And he opted, even with all of his idealism, to walk away from this client.
Yeah, I've seen it myself. As I've described to you before we started, I have been with family members and things that reflect very much what you're talking about. I cannot underscore just how powerful this film is. It is at times it's hard to believe what you're watching. It's hard to believe kind of the brazenness by which these people are being dealt with in this prison, in what we see. And I think it's happening in America, and it's happening in a state and a part of the country that has a history of complicated history with race. It's hard not to see that as well. And there's too much here, and to look away.
But it's all, it's also worth noting. I mean, that the system in Alabama is sort of an equal opportunity destroyer.
No, I agree.
There's no question that the racial underpinnings of incarceration are hugely important, but it's also the case that, and the story that we follow kind of subverts that assumption that, well, I kind of already, I've seen this before, I've seen this happen, or there's somehow, this is a Southern problem or something like that, when it clearly is not a Southern problem. We have, terrible things happening in Rikers Island in New York City in our jails, and they have horrible things happening in California, which is theoretically a liberal state. And we've shown the film to conservatives who said, even though I see myself as being tough on crime, this is not what I mean by tough on crime. This is a whole other thing that I'm not advocating for.
No, I get it. I hear you. I hear you. It just comes to mind that there's a prison in Louisiana called the Plantation.
Oh.
And it's built on an actual plantation. Yeah. So it's kind of hard not to see it, but I agree with you, Andrew. I know that I know what you're saying is to be true, and it's hard not.
I mean, certainly we know the history of mass incarceration, evolving from slavery into convict leasing, et cetera. But what we see in Alabama does exist across the country. It's just that what makes Alabama unique is that we had the opportunity to see it.
Yes.
There was an opening. And I think if people were to read Department of Justice reports that are put out about other states, or they were to read some, incredible investigative reporting that has been done across the country, they'll read similar realities, but they just don't get to see it. And it doesn't land the way. So I hope, and one thing, obviously our film is titled The Alabama Solution, but we hope it will spark a conversation.
Yes.
How the Alabama solution has really become the American solution.
Right.
And is it a solution at all, or is it actually just perpetuating the issues that it's supposed to correct?
Yeah, it is powerful. It is, there is just so much it goes right to your bones when you're watching it. I mean, really, literally, like I was, stunned, shocked. As I said, I've been around this issue for a while, but to see it play out in real time the way that it does in this film, it's very, very powerful. So congratulations on it. The film will be screening in select theaters in New York and Los Angeles this Friday, October 3rd. It will be on HBO Max on the 10th of October. I urge anyone who cares about justice and or humanity, how about that, to check out the Alabama Solution. Thank you so much. We've been joined today by the co-directors, Andrew Jarecki, as well as Charlotte Kaufman. Come back anytime. I appreciate it. Thanks so much for being here today.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. And if you have any,
you really appreciate it.
You have been listening to Cinemaphile with Mike Kaspar, the place where you will hear from the best in independent documentary and foreign filmmakers. Please check out our previous interviews as well as upcoming interviews and special programming by going to cinemaphilepod.com. We are also available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube, searchable under Cinemaphile with Mike Kaspar. Until next time, thank you for listening.